Today we'll look at Raymond Martin's article, A Fast Car and a Good Woman. Probably one of the best philosophy article titles of all time. Martin is interested in the same central question as Nagel and Taylor. What's the meaning of life? And as we said, there are a number of different ways we might take this. We might ask, what's the meaning of life in general? What's the meaning of human life? What's the meaning of your life? And different philosophers that we've looked at have been asking different questions. Martin begins by distinguishing between two things, what he calls the problem of the meaning of life and what he calls the problem of life. The problem of the meaning of life is a philosophical problem. It's the question of how, if at all, our lives can be worth living. Is there some overriding purpose or pattern for human life? Is there an objective source of value for our lives? Then, the problem of life is a practical problem. This is the question of how can we live our lives so they are as worth living as possible? This is a question about your life. The problem of the meaning of life seems to be a question about human life or life in general. Martin's central example is of Leo Tolstoy, author and philosopher. Tolstoy was a 19th century Russian author, and it's hard to overestimate just how big he was. Tolstoy was enormously famous. Tolstoy was read in so many languages, in so many countries. He was enormously well regarded, enormously wealthy, wealthy beyond what he could possibly spend. So he's famous, he's wealthy, he's intelligent, but because he lives in 19th century Russia, there's no paparazzi knocking at his door, so he also has privacy. He's able to get on with what he wants to do. He's got a wonderful wife, he's got beautiful, healthy children. Everything is coming up Milhouse for Tolstoy. But Tolstoy reports being overcome by what Martin is calling the problem of the meaning of life. He says more and more often questions like why and what now came more and more frequently. Tolstoy says, I was absolutely unable to make any reply. The questions were not waiting, and I had to answer them at once. If I did not answer them, I could not live. So Martin asks, are Tolstoy's existential worries, his dread about meaning, what's really dragging him down? If he could answer them, would he actually be happy? Martin suggests that questions are not necessarily psychological problems. Philosophical questions can give rise to psychological problems when the questioner's sense of security is built on a foundation of unquestioned beliefs that the questions start poking at. When the beliefs are questioned and there aren't immediate obvious answers, the result can be turmoil, it can be painful, it can be confusing. But the suffering here, Martin says, comes from revelations about one's own personal ideologies, realization that you've built your worldview on shifting sand. There was nothing there. So the problem here is not a philosophical problem. If there's going to be a philosophical challenge to the meaning of life, it's going to have to apply more widely than this. So Martin wants to know, how likely is it that psychological problems are going to arise from philosophical questions when our lives are going pretty well? So Martin turns to the guy who got us started, Nagel. On Nagel's view, philosophical challenges to meaning threaten human life with objective meaninglessness. Even when life is at its subjective best, even when things are going really well. The fact is, all of it is meaningless, Nagel says. All of it is arbitrary and pointless. As such, on Nagel's view, philosophical challenges to meaning are going to be a chronic source of deep psychological problems. Viewed from the outside, we see the absurdity in our lives. He says this loss of conviction that arises from awareness of the absurdity and then the attempt to regain conviction again is the problem of the meaning of life. But there's no way around it. We can't abandon this objective view, Nagel says, because it's just part of what it means to be human. So really, there is no solution to the philosophical problem of the meaning of life. You just have to deal with it. So Tolstoy would argue that philosophical questions can bring you down. Certainly brought him down. Nagel would say that if you're honest with yourself and you're honest about the questions, they will bring you down. All you can do is deal with it or try to avoid it. Tolstoy reports that he solved his problem by embracing Christianity. And before you get on too high of a horse here, it's important to note that 19th century Russian Christian orthodoxy bears very little resemblance to 21st century American Christianity. But in any event, Nagel would say that Tolstoy is just lying to himself. He's just pretending the problem isn't there. Okay, let's try a little experiment. I want you to close your eyes. I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to think of a time in your life when your life was at its best, when everything was great, when things couldn't have gotten better. Think of a time when everything was going your way. It could have been for a short time, it could have been for a long time. It could have been a long time ago, it could have been last week. I've asked this question any number of times to any number of students, and I've gotten any number of answers. I had one student say, the 10 years she lived in Hawaii, that's when her life was at its subjective best. And I said, all 10 years? And she said, yes, every moment. I had one guy answer, when he's washing his truck, and he's just finishing and he's polishing his mags, and the light is just glinting off it at that moment, everything is perfect. Whether your perfect moment, your subjective best, lasted for years or just a moment, were you worried about the meaning of life? Nagel says, questions about the meaning of life don't bother you at a time like that. They're not problems. Rather, when your life is at its subjective best, you've solved the problem of life, at least temporarily. So questions about the meaning of life didn't arise. And if they did, you'd have dismissed them as irrelevant. You would have said, don't bother me, go away, I'm happy. When we're happy, questions about the meaning of life don't become problems. So the solution to the problem of the meaning of life is simple. Be happy. If you're happy, there's no problem. But now we have a practical question. How does one become happy? People often choose the wrong path to happiness, and so they suffer. We make the wrong choice. Sometimes we're just stupid. Sometimes it's just bad luck. But that itself doesn't give rise to a philosophical problem about the meaning of life. Next, Martin turns to Taylor. Again, the book that Martin is referencing was published years before the Taylor article that we read, so Taylor's written a whole book on this as well. Like Nagel, for Taylor, philosophical questions about the meaning of life arise from a clash between objective meaninglessness and subjective meaning. On Taylor's view, our lives are objectively meaningless. He agrees with Nagel about that much. There's no objective scale of meaning out there. But Taylor would say that doesn't mean our lives are thus meaningless. Taylor argues that when people willfully set tasks for themselves, there's no need to ask questions about meaning. He says, what counts is that one should be able to begin a new task, a new castle, a new bubble. For Taylor, meaning comes from within. It's the value we derive from our willful activities. Instead of going out into the world and trying to find meaning to scrape off for ourselves, we put the meaning out there by acting in the world, by acting creatively. The problem, Martin says, is everywhere we look, we're going to see people acting willfully. Here's your basement dwelling pot smoking video game playing friend. He's acting willfully. This is his own choice. He decided to do this. But we don't want to say he's thus acting meaningfully, Martin says. The problem is that Taylor makes things too easy. He sees meaning everywhere. Meaning is going to be ubiquitous. It's practically impossible on his view to not lead a meaningful life. Nagel sees it nowhere because there's nothing you can do about it. Your life is not meaningful, and no change to your life will make it meaningful. But Martin says neither of these accounts seems psychologically valid. That's just to say, neither one feels right. Neither one reflects how we generally think about the world. Which is to say, some people lead meaningful lives. Other people don't. Some people are wasting their lives. A lot of people aren't. What we'd like, ideally, is a view that somehow explains that view we have about the world, rather than making it all or nothing. Curiously, Martin says, Taylor points at an idea, but doesn't actually follow through on it, and it's an idea that seems to have a lot more promise. This is the idea that people have meaningful lives, not in virtue of doing what they will to do, but in virtue of doing what they love to do. On this kind of view, Martin suggests, meaning will be possible, but not ubiquitous, not inevitable. Because most people are not doing what they love to do. They're doing what they feel they have to do. They're going to work, they're going to class, they're making dinner, they're doing the dishes. If you've ever seen the bumper sticker, I'd rather be, that's what he has in mind. What is the thing that you would rather be doing? That thing that you love to do. On this view, meaning is going to come in degrees. It's not going to be an all or nothing affair. Some people's lives are going to be more meaningful than others, and your life might be more meaningful or less meaningful now than it was a year ago, a week ago, a day ago. And it's not that human life is going to be inherently meaningful. You don't get meaning simply in virtue of being born human, but it can be meaningful on this view. And it will be meaningful largely to the degree that you're doing what you love to do. Now, Martin acknowledges that this view might seem hopelessly romantic because it's going to collapse the problem of the meaning of life into the practical problem of finding out what you love to do and doing it. Martin turns to a quote from author Oscar Wilde, who says, "There are only two tragedies in life. One is not getting what one wants, and the other is getting it." Oscar Wilde is mostly known for being witty. It's easy to see how never getting what you want would be a problem, being constantly disappointed. And if you want the wrong things, well, getting them could obviously be a problem too, making that bad choice. But what if you want the right things? When your life was at its subjective best, Martin says, so far as you could tell, you were probably completely satisfied. All of your unsatisfied desires that might detract from your happiness were, at least temporarily, driven out of you. The problem is, inevitably, that doesn't last. Martin says, life is a tease. It promises more lasting satisfaction than it delivers. No matter how good it gets, eventually we always find ourselves wanting more. If we lost what was satisfying us completely, we want it back. If we keep it, we want more of it, or else we want something else. And we will want in a way that detracts from our happiness. Martin says, most of us tend to think that if only we had some X, whatever that is, we could be completely happy. If only I had $5,000. If I had $5,000, Oh, that could solve all my problems. I would be happy. Or if only I had a girlfriend or a boyfriend or just a healthy relationship with somebody, then all those problems wouldn't really be problems. Or if only I had a better relationship with my family. Or if only I had a career or like some idea of a career, some direction to go in life, then I could be happy. So being deprived of that X gives us the illusion that complete satisfaction is possible if only we had X. And that was Tolstoy's problem. Tolstoy was healthy, he had a wonderful wife, he had beautiful children, he was enormously talented, he was famous, he was ridiculously wealthy. There was nothing left for him to want. Anything he wanted, he could get pretty much instantly. And because of that, he was plagued with this existential angst. Martin suggests that having obtained everything he could have wanted, Tolstoy's life couldn't stay at its subjective best. He was satisfied, but he couldn't stay satisfied. He had everything, but he wanted more. Now, Buddhists tell us that there's a simple solution to this problem. Don't want. If you don't want, you won't suffer. Get rid of desire. But unlike Craig, for most of us, this simply isn't a practical answer. In contemporary Western life, really all you've done is just add one more unsatisfied desire, the desire to not desire. So while doing what you love may be the most important contribution you can make to meaningfulness in your life, Martin says, there might not be any fully satisfying solution to the problem of life. Like Sisyphus, we either have to continually resatisfy ourselves or else distract ourselves from the fact that we haven't. So we can push the boulder to the top of the hill and be happy briefly, but then the boulder's going to roll back down and we have to start over again. So it's kind of a measured solution. And having reached that measured solution, we can, Martin says, redirect our energies from solving our problem of the meaning of life to our individual problems of life, finding our individual recipes for happiness, say a fast car and a good woman, hence the title of the paper, or whatever it is that you think will do it for you, that you think will put your life at its subjective best, that will put you on top of that hill and follow it. Now, having reached a measured solution to the problem, Martin needs to end on a down note by talking about death. The prospect of death, he says, threatens the meaning in our lives centrally because it ends that struggle for satisfaction, that irrational but deep-seated belief that if only I had more time, I could get X, I could be completely satisfied. So those moments when our lives are at their subjective best is a kind of victory over death. Okay, so now I get to tell you a story. And it's a story that begins in Carlsbad, New Mexico. I went on a trip with my wife and my stepson to Carlsbad Caverns, which is a whole underground cavern system that's measured in football field units. There I am. Okay. So when you go to Carlsbad Caverns, you're given a choice about how to get in and how to get out. You can take the switchbacks in, there I am, and take the elevator out, or you can take the elevator down and then walk out through the switchbacks. And we said to the woman who was selling us tickets, well, how do you choose between these? And she said, well, walking down the switchbacks is hard on your knees, and walking up is a bit of effort for your cardiovascular system. And I said, well, I've got bad knees, so I guess that'll help make the choice. So we took the elevator down and we explored the cave system. And after we were down there for a couple of hours, we get to the switchbacks to get back out. And at this point, we're about a quarter mile underground. So we start walking along like these people do. And I get about to the point where they were, and my fingertips have gone numb, which is a weird feeling. I can't feel my fingertips anymore. And then I start to feel a pressure on my chest. It was like there was a fat man sitting on my chest, and every step I took, that man got fatter. And I got to about here, and I said to my wife, I think we have to stop. And she said, why? And I said, I think I'm having a heart attack. And I was 41 at the time. That's pretty young for a heart attack, but I've never felt anything like this before. So I sat down there, and my stepson ran the quarter mile of switchbacks up to the top to go find help. But he never came back. Never saw him again. I don't know what happened to him. So after we waited there, my wife decided she would go up and see if she could find help. So she went up the switchbacks. And within a couple of minutes of that happening, coming from behind me was a ranger. And the ranger said, "Are you okay, sir?" Because I was sitting down in the middle of these relatively thin paths. And I said, "No, I think I'm having a heart attack." And boom, he got out the walkie-talkie, because you know what doesn't work a quarter mile underground? Cell phones. So he calls up the other rangers, and pretty soon there's a cluster of them around me. And they're doing what they can. They're taking vital signs and they're calling the EMTs. Okay. So I'm sitting there now surrounded by rangers who are checking my blood pressure, and they are checking my heart rate, and they are nodding knowingly and making little notes every 5 minutes or so. Now eventually, and it took quite a while, the EMTs come down from the top, and they say they can't take me back to the elevator because I can't really walk at this point because every step makes it worse. And so they're going to have to get me up to the top. So luckily, up at the top, there is an electric wheelchair. And so they're going to bring that down to me. But it gets about halfway down and then it breaks down. Okay, so luckily there's a backup electric wheelchair. And that one gets about a quarter of the way down and it breaks down. Okay. At this point, I've been sitting here for about 2 hours. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm probably having a heart attack. People die from heart attacks. Heart attacks are what kill people pretty regularly, every day. So there's a pretty good chance that here, a quarter mile underground in Carlsbad, New Mexico, I'm going to die. And I thought, I'm okay with that. I mean, if that's when it happens, it's not what I would have chosen, but it's okay. I have a wonderful family. I've accomplished a lot of things in life I set out to accomplish. All things considered, it's been a good life. So if I die here, I could die happy. Maybe you've heard that phrase before. I could die happy. Now, I didn't die. They ended up bringing down a manual regular wheelchair for me, and because we were clustering in this thin little path, people couldn't get past us, so there was a big cluster of humans behind us, and then it was like pulling Santa out. I had people with ropes in front of me, EMTs pulling, two behind me, pushing the wheelchair, getting me up a quarter mile of ramps to the top. They eventually got me into the ambulance. The reason it took so long is because when the ambulance came out to get me, it broke down. They had to send a second ambulance, and eventually they got me to the hospital and they performed the surgery. I was indeed having a heart attack at that point for 3.5 hours, which is bad, and they saved my life. Now, the reason that you're taking this class online and I'm not teaching it in person is because, well, I have a really bum ticker at this point. About a year ago, they put one of these into me. This is a defibrillator and pacemaker. So if my heart ever decides it's going to stop again, and my cardiologist tells me sudden death is a real chance for me at any time, then this thing might save my life. Okay, that'd be pretty good. So we're back here. I have very good reason to stay up here on top of that wave, because at any time I could die. Of course, the same is true for you, except, in your case, it might be getting hit by a bus. So I have very good reason to stay up here, to say I could die happy, to have that victory over death. Martin says, when our experience gets that good, when your life is at its subjective best, we've won the battle for satisfaction, and death holds no terror. The problem is that our victory is only temporary, so you have to try and stay on top of that wave as long as you can. Okay, we were talking about Nagel, and although Martin is looking at a book that Nagel wrote, not the paper we read, it's still the same basic argument he's looking at. For life to be meaningful, it must be objectively meaningful. If there are no objective standards of meaning in the universe, it's not possible for life to be objectively meaningful. There are no objective standards of meaning in the universe, so life is not meaningful. Taylor took issue with that first premise, that for life to be meaningful, it must be objectively meaningful. Taylor wanted to argue that life can be meaningful even though there's no such thing as objectively meaningful lives because of subjective meaning. So let's recall Taylor's argument. Taylor argued that a meaningful life is one that is not meaningless. So we're going to find the ingredients of meaninglessness and then reverse those. A meaningless life is one that lacks real achievable goals of one's own creation. He got there by analyzing the life of Sisyphus and others to figure out what made that life meaningless. So reversing that, a meaningful life is one that does not lack real achievable goals of one's own creation. So, in conclusion, a meaningful life will be one that's directed to real achievable goals of one's own creation, where these goals are genuinely noble, beautiful, or otherwise lastingly worthwhile. Now, as we noted last class, Taylor's argument contains a non sequitur, so it's not even a valid argument. But if we get rid of that conclusion, T3 is a conclusion on its own, that a meaningful life is one that does not lack real achievable goals of one's own creation. In other words, a meaningful life is one that has real achievable goals of one's own creation. Now, when Martin is looking at Taylor's argument, again, he's looking at a book that Taylor wrote and not the article we did, but the book is basically this argument, T1, T2, T3. So it leaves out the non sequitur. But Martin says he finds it unsatisfying to say that a meaningful life is simply one that doesn't lack real achievable purpose of one's own creation, a mere matter of acting according to one's will. In other words, Martin suggests that the argument hasn't actually given us a sufficient condition of meaningfulness, never mind a necessary and sufficient condition. So, while Martin agrees with Taylor that the problem with Nagel's argument was that first premise, that life has to be objectively meaningful to be meaningful, Martin has a different argument for what does make life meaningful, or what can. So, let's walk through Martin's argument. First premise. If one is able to live one's life so that it is as worth living as possible, the problem of life, one will have meaning in one's life. Second premise. One is able to live one's life so that it's as worth living as possible, so long as all of one's desires are satisfied. All of one's desires are satisfied when life is at its subjective best. Life is at its subjective best when one is doing what one loves to do. Therefore, one will have meaning in one's life if one is doing what one loves to do. Now, like Nagel's argument and Taylor's argument, there's just a few working parts going on here, a few more than we had before, but we're going to see that this is a pretty straightforward argument form. So let's take a look at that first premise. If one is able to live one's life so that it's as worth living as possible, one will have meaning in one's life. Of A, B, C, D, and E, which are the relevant parts? Well, A's right there talking about having meaning in one's life and being able to live one's life so it's as worth living as possible. So it looks like A and B are going to be our parts. Now the question is, what's the relationship between them? The first thing that we notice if we look at M1 is the if. This suggests a conditional, an if-then statement. If one is able to live one's life so it is worth living as possible, then one will have meaning in one's life. If there was a negation on both sides, we'd be talking about a necessary condition, but there isn't, so it looks like a sufficient condition. If one is able to live one's life so it's as worth living as possible, B, then one will have meaning in one's life, A. Okay, let's move on to M2. One is able to live one's life so that it's as worth living as possible, so long as all of one's desires are satisfied. Well, it looks like we've got B, one is able to live one's life so it's as worth living as possible, and C, all of one's desires are satisfied. Now, what's the relationship between them? Here we see something interesting. So long as. Basically, this is saying B so long as C. So long as is just another way of saying if. B if C. And that's just another way of saying if C, then B. So it looks like we've got another sufficient condition. If C, all of one's desires are satisfied, then B, one is able to live one's life so it's as worth living as possible. Okay, M3. All of one's desires are satisfied when life is at its subjective best. Okay, what's relevant here? We're talking about desires being satisfied again, and we're talking about life being at its subjective best. Okay, C and D. Now let's have a look at M3. Okay, we don't have an if, we don't have a so long as, we have a when. But that also seems to act like an if. All of one's desires are satisfied when life is at its subjective best. All of one's desires are satisfied if life is at its subjective best. Okay, so if life is at its subjective best, then all of one's desires are satisfied. If D, then C. Okay, starting to see a pattern here. M4. Life is at its subjective best when one is doing what one loves to do. Okay, life is at its subjective best. One is doing what one loves to do. D and E. Again, we have a when, so we're looking at another sufficient condition, it seems. So, if one is doing what one loves to do, then life is at its subjective best. If E, then D. Okay, finally, conclusion. One will have meaning in one's life if one is doing what one loves to do. All right, we've got A, one will have meaning in one's life, and E, one is doing what one loves to do, and smack in the middle of that is an if. So, one will have meaning in one's life if one is doing what one loves to do. If one is doing what one loves to do, one will have meaning in one's life. If E, then A. All right. So we have a series of sufficient conditions. I like to call this a ladder argument. And to show why it's a ladder argument, we're going to test validity. According to M4, if E, then D. So if E is true, then D is true. But if D is true, M3 tells us, then C is true. If C is true, then B is true. And if B is true, then A is true. We're just walking up the rungs of the ladder. And that's what our conclusion says. If we start at the bottom, we'll get to the top. If E, then A. So it looks like a valid argument. So our question has been, what is the meaning of life? We've cashed that out a bunch of different ways, but what I want to ask is this an important question? And if so, why? Why do you care? Why do I care? Why would anybody care? Why does this bother Tolstoy so much? Why do so many philosophers write about it? Do we want to find fulfillment in our lives? Do we want to understand our own place in the universe, whether it's my place or the place of humanity or the place of life in general? Do you want to be able to evaluate or reevaluate your goals, your aspirations? Are there moral reasons to care about the meaning of life? Are there people who lead meaningless lives? Nagel thinks that everybody leads a meaningless life. Taylor seems to think it's going to be pretty rare, and Martin thinks it's going to come in degrees. Are there people who are wasting their lives? Like your basement-dwelling, pot-smoking, video game-playing friend? Or Matt? Or Craig? Are you one of them? If you're not, what are you doing that's different from the people who are wasting their lives? Are lives the sort of things that can be wasted?